We are here today to talk about the hard truth about cloud migrations. And I'm going to do a very quick introduction of the problem space here and the way that we look at it. But first, I want to let our fantastic panelists introduce themselves. They are going to give us a nice variety of industry perspectives today. And we are lucky, first off, to have Andrew from GigaOM with us today to share what he's seeing in the industry. Andrew, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you're working on?
Sure. My name is Andrew Green. I'm a networking and security research analyst with GigaOM, and I'm also the author of the Network Observability Report, which is a piece of work where we feature Kentik.
Amazing. Thank you so much for joining us. We're looking forward to hearing your perspective. And
My pleasure.
Yeah, thank you. We're also joined by Mike from Kentik. You're up, Mike.
Hey, Mike Figueres. I've been in the industry for about 25 years, and mostly in the network monitoring and observability space. I've worked with a lot of enterprises over the years, helping them to understand what's going on in their networks. And, most recently, there has obviously been a major shift to the cloud. So I've been helping people understand how to get from one place to another, as well as how to get the monitoring, because it's so much different. So this is part of what my career has been, up until now and most recently, and hopefully I can provide some good insight into that here.
Sounds good. And last but not least, we're joined by Yevgen, also from Kentik. Say hello.
Hi, thank you, Rosalind. Yes, my name is Yevgen Vakulenko. I'm a product manager at Kentik, where I'm responsible for the Kentik cloud solutions, covering different multi-cloud setups and hybrid cloud setups. And mostly my work is after we are breaking cloud delusions for a lot of customers and prospects to make sure we deliver the value to them. We fix their picture, we fix their environments, and we are making sure that they are comfortable running it forward. So distilling the value out of the use cases, understanding the problems, and fixing it with our product, that's probably my main task here at Kentik.
All right. Well, let's dig in. I'm going to do my quick intro now. If I had to put my finger on one reason that we are here today, I think it's that the enterprise, I'm slide challenged. Sorry in advance. I think that the enterprise networks that we use to do business with today are more complex than ever. And in some big ways, cloud really simplifies application delivery and simplifies networking too. But in some other, maybe even bigger ways, the cloud, like the things that cloud abstracts away, leads to even greater complexity, especially as we're now using a huge variety of different tools and services to run our software and run our organizations. So that's one of the things that I want to talk about today. And just a little bit of background on Kentik. At Kentik, we are a group of practitioners who look at software delivery starting with the network perspective. And so enterprises delivering applications, processing transactions, enabling customers and employees to compute globally. We're looking at that from a network perspective first on up. And one thing that we've observed is a big change, as a big change in the industry is that not only is it not all your network anymore, with a lot of enterprises that we work with, it's mostly not your network anymore. So much of what we do is living in various clouds now. So we're going to talk about cloud migrations today and the lessons that we've learned in making enterprise companies successful with hybrid cloud. And as we do that, we're also going to look at how networks play a key role in cost, performance, and data security, data integrity as workloads move among public and private clouds. So on the one hand, some aspects of the network are abstracted away in cloud environments, but as our environments become more complex and more heterogeneous, more varied between multi-cloud, private cloud, SaaS resources, the network is one common language that virtually all of your resources speak. And getting insight into network data can become really important, especially as those resources scale. So that's my soapbox. But now I know you're all here to learn about common challenges that organizations face as they move their workloads to the public cloud. So I want to get into the conversation. We are going to talk about a few broader trends in the industry and what the word migration even means today. But first, I actually want to talk a little bit about complexity. And Andrew, I want to hear from you first. Now, most organizations today are running hybrid environments. Can you share some techniques and strategies to optimize this type of complex environment?
Sure, great question. Thank you, Rosalind. Well, first off, hybrid environments are the future, but they're also really a mess to work with. And that's because most enterprises don't really have a hybrid environment strategy, but rather have been doing small migrations or have been doing new cloud-based products or tools that essentially get you a hybrid environment. But when you say hybrid, I often hear this misconception that it's just like I have an on-premise workload and then I have just some sort of cloud. But realistically, it's more multi-dimensional than that because you've got on-premises workloads, you've got multiple public clouds, not just one public cloud. You've got private clouds, you might have colocation, you might have managed hosting. And even within those on-premises workloads, if you have, for example, a stack at a corporate HQ in New York, and then you have another stack in Sydney for regional opco, it's not really an apples-to-apples comparison. But the good thing about having a hybrid cloud environment is that you have everything that you want already available. So if you have multiple public clouds, you might have access to different types of services. You still have your own premises infrastructure if you want to have like predictable workloads that you want to run and so on. But the cloud in those types of scenarios are best used if you want to do, for example, expand to new geographies. For example, if you want to have to expand your products, let's say in Asia, South America, something like that. And you don't want to invest all your capex in setting up the network infrastructure, compute, and storage, it's best to use just a cloud. Or you can use it for creating minimal viable products or the product development, anything that would benefit from this like ephemeral tendency of the cloud, but then something that can also scale. And with scaling, there's also this point that I don't see people talking about near often enough. And it's something like cloud bursting, for example. Let's say I have my on-premises workloads and my usage is very predictable, but then you get to a period like Christmas or maybe Super Bowl, and you need to allocate a bunch more capacity all of a sudden. Yeah, exactly, that's it. Mm-hmm. So in those types of scenarios, if you can set up this cloud bursting architecture and you have your on-premises running at normal capacity, you can just make up the difference using a cloud environment. And that's exactly where the power of the hybrid cloud is. But you really need to be strategic about it. If you just do, let's migrate one workload, let's do everything on the cloud, and then it just ends up having a bunch of complexity and not a lot of the benefits.
That makes a lot of sense. I like how you're thinking strategically. You're being thoughtful about that global expansion and what the benefits of cloud are there, and then also thinking about performance, because we know every day on the internet is not the same, and every day for your business is not the same. So that makes sense. And I think we're going to dig a bit more into some of those performance things and capacity things as we continue to talk. But before we go too much further, I want to get into a concrete discussion about some gotchas to help you folks in the audience. But before we do that, for those of you listening in, just want to say, as questions come to you, please ask them in the Q&A module or in the chat. We want to prioritize answering your questions first, so I will work them into the conversation as we go. We can also do a little Q&A at the end, but I'd rather not wait. If we don't have to, we want to hear what's on your mind today. That's totally why we're here. So if you have anything, throw it out in the Q&A. And then, Mike, let's go over to you. Can you talk about some common technical hurdles that organizations like you've seen facing when migrating legacy applications to the cloud? What are those hurdles?
Yeah, I mean, I think, first and foremost is having to reimagine and redesign and re-architect applications in order to make best use of the cloud. So, what I mean by that is, we kind of mentioned the elasticity and the ability to expand. it doesn't make a lot of sense a lot of time to take say a monolithic application, and then look at, oh, this is a Dell server that's running on this monolithic application. It's running, it has 64 CPUs and 256 gig of RAM. I'm going to move that workload over into the same footprint in AWS. So that really doesn't work well from a price cost perspective. So technically, you have to kind of step back and think about, how is this being used? Look at, your observability data for that server. Are you actually using that many CPUs? Do you need that right now? And then you'll probably built that box to handle the maximum amount of transactions that's going to see. Whereas you have to really kind of think about how to expand that. And I think that's a very hard thing for people to shift the mindset into an expandable, like maybe a microservices type architecture. Another part that is confusing people is if you're coming from an on-prem network or you're coming even from another cloud, you have to relearn all of the concepts about how these work. So if you're looking at AWS and then you're looking at Azure, even the terminology is much different. So there's a steep learning curve involved when you're going from one place to another. And, some of that is evident when we're looking at things like networking these clouds together. There's vendors who provide services like Aviatrix and some other vendors that will provide a way for you to easily connect these clouds together in a secure way. But when we start thinking about it, like security policy, things in the cloud, if you're misconfiguring that or you're misunderstanding how security works, it becomes very difficult for people to get it right on the first try. So when you're moving a workload from one place, maybe on-prem or one cloud to another cloud, making sure that your security policy is correct and as best or as close to zero trust as you can come up with. And that becomes very difficult because when you do that shift, then you're going to run into unexpected things like, oh, I forgot to open up a port for this specific application or something like that. So I think those are, the top of mind, the most common things that you see when people are moving from one place to another in the cloud. So,
and to your point, there's actually this thing where when you think about infrastructure as a service, i.e. the cloud, you think about storage and compute, but networks weren't part of the strategy. So it was kind of a necessary evil. So you have your VPCs and your VNets and so on. And then when it comes to doing multi-cloud networking or cloud to on-premises networking, it's much more difficult than you initially expect. You expect everything to be as a service, but then you get all this backend complexity with the networks. And then you have to go into your Aviatrix, Nokia, and Proximo, and all the other guys that do cloud networking, just so you can actually do networking across those environments. So simply thinking, okay, let's move my workloads to Azure and AWS is not going to be a lift and ship, at least from the networking point of view.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And I think that's part of the understanding of the re-architecting of the network is that most people tend to have this thought, or they go and they do some testing and they think that the network is free. And then once they come to realize that, so like a good example is somebody who is using a NAT gateway in AWS. They charge by the gigabyte for processing data. And so say if you're moving from an on-prem environment going out to the internet and maybe depositing something in S3 buckets from your on-prem environment, and then you move that into the cloud and you replace that, whatever that firewall with a NAT gateway, suddenly you're on a meter. So it's not that you just pay for your internet connection and your firewall and then you're done. It's going to be per gigabyte. And so sometimes the transit costs that go across the firewalls and across like transit gateways and all that stuff become very unexpected costs that people see. And I say that with the NAT gateways, I think that's the most common one where people, if they're lifting and shifting an application, where they'll just kind of make the assumption that it's not going to be that expensive, and then all of a sudden, the phone rings from the accounting department and they see the AWS bill, and everybody's had that moment. I think that's worked with AWS or other clouds is unanticipated consequences of just making assumptions about what's free and what's not free.
And besides that, I think it also this strong architectural change for a lot of teams, shifting from the on-prem environment when you usually had your capital expenses, right? You have been installing your device that serves as a NAT gateway or something similar to the router, but you kind of own that and you're not on the meter mic, like you said before. But when you're shifting to the cloud, all of a sudden it becomes, yes, it's much more scalable. It's much easier to deploy, but now you pay for the consumption actually. Shifting that model from, just the box that is able to send you out some traffic or perform some networking for you out to the idea that now you're paying for the consumption. You may be surprised, but many people don't fully understand that right until they see the cloud bill, like Mike said, and that's where the surprise is coming from. I also see there's a question in the Q&A regarding the migrating legacy applications. I believe we partially answered that. So the cost model change is a big hurdle for the teams, but also for the legacy applications. Quite often customers are discovering that they don't have a very good picture of what their environment looks like, especially keeping in mind that they have to understand all the interconnects and they have to understand all the dependencies. So it is way more often than it should be that customers are discovering during the migration what their application footprint actually is. Even sometimes when they're spending, significant effort trying to understand and map all the details, all the dependencies to make sure the migration is successful, it is happening way more often than it should be that they're leaving something behind. And obviously that means an outage, and that means that there should be an investigation and potentially additional migration window or whatnot in order to fix that till the end.
Yeah.
I just want to make another small point here, and I don't want to spend too much time on it, but it might be worth highlighting. If you're used to having this CapEx model, as in I'm purchasing my assets, those actually translate into value for the company, as in it on the balance sheet. But when you go to a full OpEx-based models, all of that actually goes away. So it's just operational expenditure doesn't count as an asset within the company, and that might actually be something that not a lot of people are accustomed to. But a combination between the finance people and the technical people might not realize what's actually the discrepancy that's happening here. So it's worth noting that as well.
So Mike and Yevgen brought up where networking costs fit into the cloud migration and operations picture when it comes to cost. I know cost is top of mind for most companies right now and optimizing costs. So Andrew, do you have any additional strategies that enterprises and like enterprise engineering teams can use to estimate and control costs more proactively? Like Yevgen's talking about things that happen reactively and then there's an outage, but I think costs are something that you can estimate and try to control proactively if you know how. Do you have any advice about that?
Well, I guess the first piece of advice would be that networks scale with the cloud workload as well. So you need to keep in mind stuff like egress costs, direct connects, express routes, even your ISP bill, because it might be, now that you're routing a bunch of traffic probably over the public internet to get to the cloud, if you're not doing it via direct connects or express routes, your bill might just go up. And you need to have visibility over this, at least knowing how much usage you have. After that, you can have some sort of calculation. You have an expected bill at the end of the month, such that you're not getting the letter through the post and then saying you have to pay a couple million for the networking costs alone.
Okay, so it's just a lot of new things to be thinking about and a lot of bills to juggle, I think.
I think from an app. Oh, sorry, I was going to say that. From an application perspective, I think that's part of the thing that's really hard for people to also wrap their head around is when you get that bill, you don't necessarily know what application is generating that traffic. And I think that's important to understand from an observability perspective, that you have some sort of insight as to what is generating that traffic. And so being able to do that and say, all right, do I have to move this traffic between this region and this region? Can I host this database, in a local region, instead of having all of the data go to my on-prem infrastructure or a service across the internet? It's a really something that you should think about in terms of like how you're going to attack that. And it's really important from an observability perspective. And when you get that bill, it doesn't really contain that type of information. So that's something I wanted to kind of add on there.
Yeah, I think we see that a lot at Kintiq, where people just want to understand which account, which part of the organization, which application is driving this cost, because you need that information to be able to work backwards and solve for cost control. So yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. And actually, Mike, I wanted to ping you again, because I think that's something that's top of mind also for every organization, whether they're no matter where they are in terms of cloud utilization, is security. And you mentioned refining security groups and setting up security groups, but just higher level, what are the key security concerns that enterprises should address during migration, and how can they make sure that their data is protected during the process?
Yeah, I think as you're deploying in an environment, I've talked with people who have sort of like a development deployment environment where they'll go and they'll deploy their application and then use the telemetry that they're getting out of that application to sort of build a set of policies. So essentially, I can look at this. I can create a map of what's going on in terms of traffic from one place to another, and then when I roll it into production, I know what that traffic profile looks like, that known good traffic profile, and like what I was saying, you're kind of getting as close to zero trust as possible. And if you're moving an application from an on-prem environment into a cloud environment, you could still look at this type of information and build those policies to help understand, what needs to be allowed to talk to what, right? And then maybe translate that into network policy, which is something else that is a little bit difficult to grok, because when you're going from an on-prem environment to a cloud environment, things are a little bit different in terms of what you can and can't do, and how you actually implement policy in these environments. So that's something a little bit that I think is worth thinking about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Yevgen, I wanted to ask you about compliance stuff, because I know we've spoken about this before. Can you share what kind of challenges you've seen enterprises encounter with migrated workloads around maintaining compliance? So compliance with industry, government regulations and standards. Does that come up?
Absolutely, yes. There are actually a couple of challenges that are quite different for many customers. First, and probably the most important one, because it's directly tied to the money, for the customers who are responsible to the compliance that is being enforced by some government agencies. I'm talking about the industries like financials or biopharma, or certain strategic manufacturing companies. They do have the requirements to hold the data in a certain locations. This might be, your certain geography. Sometimes you have to store the data inside the country. Sometimes you cannot. Certain governments or certain authorities require you not to store the data in the cloud, especially if that cloud does not belong to them. That's, can be another nice segue into the discussion about the sovereign cloud. But that basically creates an additional complexity for the teams that is supporting such type of the environment. That means your environment truly has to be hybrid. Some of your data you have to store in your own data center or in your own location, simply because you cannot store it in the cloud. And then kind of drives you into the situation where, well, even if you don't want to have a hybrid environment, you still must to have it, simply because you want to comply with the regulation, right? Additional form of the compliance that is not the government compliance would be your own security compliance, right? Your security folks typically have a very extensive documentation and very, complicated or long list of the requirements of how they want your data to interact with outside or with inside as well, how your applications should be able or not able to talk within your own environment. Now, enforcing that type of policy is rather a complicated task. I mean, you always can create a configuration for that, but now the testing of the configuration and ensuring that all the right configuration is in place for the large environment, it's rather a daunting task. So in order to do that, you need to see everything. You need to understand how stuff is talking to each other, where things are located, what is the actual traffic flowing here and there, and maybe sometimes get an alarm that traffic is deviating from the expected path, right? Or from the expected model of communication. Or maybe sometimes it just go into the places you never expect it to go. We had a great example from one of the customers who is, it's a big US-based enterprise who is providing help with the accounting to their customers. So all of this, I mean, it's obviously US based because that's what they're specializing at on the US tax law. But all of a sudden they started to get some traffic, and rather huge amount of traffic from the overseas, from a lot of countries who typically don't do that, who typically don't use them. And I mean, customer is not able even to provide services to them because these are completely foreign entities. But they wouldn't be able easily to see that if they wouldn't really have, a workflow, and if they wouldn't watch for it, let me put it that way. So just because they keep that in mind, that in the cloud, in the internet, everything is rather flat and you can get traffic, you can get requests from people who are connected to the internet, it is kind of important to be able to alert it that something is happening there, something is deviating from the way how it was before. And I believe that, I mean, customers were, and engineering team who was running the network for that customers were extremely happy because they were able to catch something shady and something weird there, and they were able to update their security policy and fix that basically security hole or the potential breach that might have happened before.
Okay, that you give us a lot of information about ensuring security and ensuring compliance, and I like that you're sharing your experience from the field. I do want to cut in here because we actually have a question. Grant asked a question in the chat, asking about AWS budgets versus Cost Explorer. So we're kind of going back to our controlling costs question here. I know that the difference between the two is that budgets lets you kind of create a custom spending plan for like future cost management, whereas Cost Explorer is like more of an analytics tool that helps you understand your usage and cost data. Does anyone want to take this question in a little bit more depth, like tips on AWS using budgets versus Cost Explorer?
I can probably try to answer that question. So cost issues are huge in the cloud. And the main problem why the issues exist is because of the cost obscurity. I mean, granted, cloud service providers are trying to address that with the different, configurable budgets, with the cost explorers, but yet still it requires quite often to dive way deeper into the weeds and into understanding all of your traffic patterns and attributing the particular costs to the particular endpoints. Now, typically cloud providers are able to you're able to configure the budget for the particular services, right? And they also are able to provide you the breakout of why your cost is like that, why your cost bill from the cloud service provider is like that. going through the particular services, right? This is how much you spent on the direct interconnect. This is how much you spent on the NAT gateway. This is how much you spent on EC2 or S3 instances and so on, the services and so on. But it still kind of creates sometimes challenges for the customers that it's not enough. Simply the details there are not enough. Like, okay, so I do understand that I have paid for a direct interconnect that amount of money, but who actually generated all this direct interconnect traffic, right? Who are the endpoints responsible for that? What are the services responsible for that? Maybe you have some departments who are setting up their own direct interconnects or any express routes, VPNs, and so on. Sometimes teams within customers have a little bit of the independence, so they can just, for the sake of agility and speed of implementation, they can just simply set up and stuff on their own instead of waiting for the approvals and central organization doing this for them. And that kind of creates many places where the cost can be generated, and sometimes there might be out of your control. So yeah, that's a big theme. Another big theme here is something Mike briefly talked before, the NAT gateway situation, right? Or the similar services that are providing you different forms of connectivity. Now, typically in your networking, as we all know, right, running networking for quite some time, there is more than one way to configure things. There is one way to make things talk to each other and communicate within each other. But now, what is the best one from the cost perspective? I mean, of course, there are architectural blueprints. AWS or any other cloud providers are willing usually to help you to maybe not to drive your costs down, but at least to decrease the complexity and, fix some high burning issues for you. But still, it kind of requires a lot of expertise and it requires a lot of understanding. First of all, the cloud networking in general, all the, different designs, different architectures, and the cost implicated by those designs. But also that requires you to understand your own environment. And I mean, the bigger you grow, the more complex your environment is, more people are working on that, sometimes working in silos. It's really hard to coordinate. I would call like one of the biggest challenges that is really hard for the cloud service providers to address with the budget and with the cost explorer is the coordination across different parts of organization, sharing the information between them and creating this, this general unified cost model or spend model, which is really tightly connected with your architecture. So just being able to see your architecture and connect it to the cost model, that's something that, as up to this date, cloud service providers, I think, in my opinion, had troubles solving. I'm by the way curious to hear from you guys as well, if you share my perspective or not, or maybe you have any additional questions about that. It's always cool to learn from the field.
Yeah, I mean, it takes a lot to understand what's generating costs, and the snark master in chief, Corey Quinn. I wish he was here to talk about us, because it's usually entertaining. If anybody here hasn't heard of Corey Quinn, look him up on Twitter, if you're not easily offended. Yeah, he does sort of tend to outline some of the more ridiculous things about what certain cloud providers do, particularly AWS. So he's the world's first cloud economist. He came up with that title himself. So, but I think, yeah, it's trying to understand costs. So you have these tools from these cloud providers that essentially give you ways to alert on your spend and give you an idea of what you're spending it on. But really, when you really deal in, you have to tag everything. So when you're tagging something, your flow logs, for instance, don't come with the cost allocation tags. So if you want to try to understand what that traffic is, you have to kind of marry those two things together, right? And say, okay, well, the cost allocation tag was on the interface, so I need to add that to Flowlog in order to make a meaningful query to understand what the tag was that generated that traffic. So what that workload is, what my internal customer is that's using this resource. So I feel like in the cloud providers don't necessarily make it super easy for you to understand, and that may be by design, or maybe I'm just like putting my tinfoil hat on. But I don't think that they're going out of their way to help people understand how to save money. I will, sort of shout out. I've seen some other, like in GCP and AWS, they are a little bit more helpful in making recommendations about certain things. But at the end of the day, that really granular point where you're trying to understand what's going on and what's driving cost to try to lower it is still very difficult to do unless you're really putting these data sets together for really good observability. And I'm a strong believer in that, and using that for to understand. So you have to have that feedback loop of observability to be able to go back and look at what's going on in order to make the decisions on how you're going to change how you're doing things, or what you can change to maybe lower cost.
So hearing you all talk about all these costs and all the things, and also here if you have more questions, please put them in the chat. We're happy to talk about them. It's the most exciting. Is there another one? Let me check. No, we're done with that one. Okay. Yeah. If you have more questions, put them in the chat. We're thrilled to answer them. And thanks for having that discussion. I think like one of the things that comes to mind when we're talking about these cost concerns is actually something I've heard about in the news, which is like the cloud backlash. And that's enterprises reacting to these, like, I guess, unknown cost growth by pulling data back from the cloud to on-prem. So I wanted to ask you, Andrew, from an analyst perspective, what do you think of that backlash?
Well, I've certainly seen quite a few examples about this. The two that come to mind are Amazon Prime Video, going from microservices to monoliths, which granted it might be still a monolith running in the cloud. And then the other one is about Ahrefs, like the search engine optimization company that saved millions by not going to the cloud. And when you look at both of those and the titles, it seems quite the impact. But let's look at the Amazon Prime Video first. If you look at the architecture and what they wanted to do, microservices was not the way of doing it. Maybe hindsight is 2020. I don't remember exactly how they got there. Whether it was like, let's try this product and we'll just build in the cloud, or let's do it natively in AWS so we can toot our own horn. But at one point, somebody should have looked at it, and I guess they did, and they said, the microservices architecture is not working for this. It's way too expensive and inefficient. So they've brought that into like a monolith and saved a bunch of money. Obviously, that's generated a bunch of like internet traffic around microservices are not the way of doing it. But it's just another example of you have to use what you have to use per the use case. As in, if microservices is not the way of doing it, do it as a monolith. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that, and vice versa. The other one was about Ahrefs, like saving millions by not going to the cloud. So it's essentially what those guys did. They've done a paper exercise where they've compared, like, let's see if we purchase our own hardware and run our workloads on it, we'll compare the equivalent of that to AWS EC2 and so on, and end up having like 80%, 90% cost reduction or something like that. But the problem with that was there were a few of them. First off, it was a paper exercise. The second is that they assumed that the way you behave in the cloud is the same way you behave on premises. And for example, as I said in the beginning, if you have a consistent and expected workload, it's probably best to do it on premises. You pay CapEx for it. Once you have your CapEx investment, the OpEx is fairly predictable. And as I mentioned, CapEx also translates into assets for the company. But you don't necessarily behave in the same way in the cloud. As in, again, when do you want to go to the cloud? You want to do it when you want shorter ship times. You don't want to purchase infrastructure. You don't want to invest at right now all the capex to build the infrastructure, or you want to create a minimum viable product. There's a few things that are off with it. I'm not saying that they wouldn't have saved money by going on premises rather going to the cloud, but just doing a flat out statement, let's stay on premises, it's a 90% cost reduction. It's very one-sided, and it's not really an accurate reflection of reality. So the point with both of those examples is the cloud backlash will happen when it's not the right choice, right? So again, hybrid environments are the future just because you have that sort of flexibility. If we can run something on premises, let's say we already have machines on premises, we just need to deploy it there. Do that, it's absolutely fine.
And I probably want to add a little comment to that. Sometimes you have to reevaluate your choices when you kind of growing, or developing your own company or moving into the future. It's not like one choice you have made and, okay, we made the right choice. Now we are here and we are doing that forever. Usually not. Some companies are changing, businesses are changing, and you have constantly to keep in mind, like, what's the right way of doing things? What's the right architecture? What's the right infrastructure for my current setup or my current environment?
Yeah, that's exactly it. And props to the Amazon Prime guys who've done just that. We spent too much here. Let's look if we can do some cost savings, and they did.
Yeah, and that's another thing to kind of look at, is to understand like where your workloads belong. And so that doesn't always mean that if you have an expensive compute workload, you need to bring that back in-house. There are other providers that can provide those compute resources that work just fine for that. And I think from what I've seen over the last year, the trend for just raw compute has been for people to look at OCI because there's a large cost savings being offered by OCI as compared to what they're paying in the other big three. So even though they're leaving a lot of their infrastructure in those clouds, they're not just completely migrating and moving over, but they're looking at that and say, oh my gosh, I can save a ton of money if I'm just crunching bits over here. Send the work over to the OCI, and then let it do its thing, and then you bring it back. So, and that's where the multi-cloud or even the super cloud or whatever you want to call it now starts to come into play, is being able to sort of move these workloads around. And I think that's another thing that one of our our CEO Avi talks about, cloud jail. You getting yourself locked into cloud services. And so there's a lot of ways that you can get locked in cloud jail. If all your data lives inside a cloud, it costs nothing to put it in there. It costs a lot to take it out, right? So on a, when you're on a petabyte scale, AWS will charge you nothing to get it there, but it will cost you money to get it back out. So, so those are things that you also probably need to think about. When you're moving data around or you're moving services around, can I take this from the database service that is proprietary to AWS and move this easily to another vendor? And if the answer is no, chances are you're probably not going to be happy with that decision later on, from what I've seen. But I'm sure there's people that are happily using those types of services right now and would take issue with that. But from what I've seen, those types of things kind of get you locked in, and it's not something that I think is a really great idea a lot of the time.
It really seems like when we say cloud migration, it means something different today than it did 5 to 10 years ago. It's more about like moving. And I find this, like when I'm writing copy about the stuff, like I want to say moving workloads among clouds versus moving workloads to the clouds, because it really is a strategic picture about where you're putting your data, where you're hosting your services, and what your priorities are. And I think it's different for every use case, right? Different for every company.
Yeah, it's lateral. It's not just north south. It's definitely lateral as well, moving workloads from one place to another. I agree.
There was this I wouldn't necessarily say strategy, but I guess it was the common consensus maybe about 10 years ago or such. When they were pushing movement to the cloud, it wasn't necessarily it wasn't mature in the sense that it is today. As in, we know we expect some sort of complexity, we know we expect some sort of like east-west migrations, but it was rather a way of, if you have those legacy applications running on premises, what usually happens is you need to decommission the service itself. You might need to decommission the hardware, keep the lights on, all the kind of stuff. And then when the cloud guys were coming and saying, you can actually take that, put it in the cloud, and you don't need to worry about it anymore. And I guess that those were like the first ideas of doing cloud migrations, and that's exactly what why we got to this hybrid environment today. We're doing all those small migrations. Often they might not be compatible, and so on. So it's really not the same as it was 10 or 5-10 years ago, but it's more of a strategic choice. Let's see where we want to build. Let's see what we can move between clouds. Mike, you mentioned about the Oracle Cloud. There's also alternatives like Linode, now acquired by Akamai, or OVH Cloud or DigitalOcean. Those guys might have some different pricing models, might be a bit more cost efficient for some types of workloads compared to others. So it's also worth exploring the cloud market itself.
Yeah. And I mean, on the other side of that, you mentioned DigitalOcean, like on the other side of that is platform as a service, where you're maybe paying more, but you're getting more abstraction. So it's all there. I think there's a lot of strategy that goes into figuring out how to implement each workload. But a lot of times I find that especially a lot of companies, it ends up being not so much a strategy, but it's more like the people on the team who are working on a particular set of workloads or a particular application, they're using the tools that they're comfortable with. So that comes up a lot too. Yeah. We could keep going. I have more questions in the hopper, but I know we're coming up on the hour here. Does anyone have anything that they really wanted to talk about, either in the audience? Do you have a question that you didn't get a chance to ask? Or any of our panelists, do you have something that you really wanted to say on the topic of the hard truth about cloud migrations? I guess one remaining question that I had that I think, Mike, we were talking about was like, how do you choose which workloads to migrate first? If you are trying to get into that strategic mindset, like how do you select the best candidates to move first?
I mean, I would say that, you would have to really understand like what's easiest for you to move. So like if I have a Postgres server and I need to move that Postgres to a managed Postgres service, I can look at what that might cost to run. And so it really is a lift and shift. You could use a managed Postgres service, or you could model what you think that's going to cost in the cloud. And so moving the low hanging fruit, as it were, first would be where I would kind of start. But when you start talking about applications and you have, like I was talking about, like a monolith, that you absolutely need to re-architect, I would save that for last, because you really have to think about it rather than jump in and just say, all right, I'm just going to copy paste this environment from one place to another, when you know that you can scale it out differently from a different perspective, or re-architect how things are working or how they interact with each other in a way that's going to save money. And you have to kind of think about it from the perspective is what do I have for idle on my cloud workloads, or my on-prem workloads that I'm going to migrate? Is there any amount of idle that I'm looking at right now, and how can I avoid having that idle when I move that workload over? Is it by having a service that bills on how much you eat, or is it to buy a smaller instance and have that application somehow auto scale? when demand gets higher. I think those are the types of things where you want to avoid jumping the gun and spending too much or provisioning too much to actually sit there and do nothing. If you have resources that aren't doing anything in the cloud, that's just like lighting money on a fire. You might as well. Whereas when you buy that stuff for an on-prem environment, you're buying it at whatever the maximum amount that you feel that needs to scale to in order to make that application function. So those are the things that like just start with the low-hanging fruit and avoid all of the idle stuff that's going on. And if you see it, talk to somebody who can help you scale it or re-architect that in order to make sure that you're getting your bang for your buck.
Go ahead.
I just wanted to say this this last thing about cloud migrations. It's a bit like moving house, which I've done too much of in the past couple of years. And by that I mean that when you move your house, you might have to have two places rented at the same time, instead of spending your time doing whatever you have to pack and then unpack. You might end up spending some nights at a hotel because your mattress is bunched up and the bed is dismembered. And that's exactly what happens when you have to migrate applications to the cloud as well. So you need to have the landing environment in the cloud, but you still need to have business continuity, make sure that the application that runs on premises is going to run on premises while you're re-architecting or just lifting and shifting to the cloud. You need to invest developer time in it as well. So it's not just a matter of, okay, I have this is going to be a one-day transition and no overhead costs attached to it. You also have to take into consideration development time where I'm not actually investing those resources anymore. What's going to cost me to decommission my on-prem services? If I have to do migrations between clouds, I need to have this infrastructure set up and that infrastructure set up. I need to have test environments, production environments, and so on. So costs pile up, and you just need to have visibility across all of them.
Yeah, visibility I think is really key to being able to make those strategic decisions and make that transition in a way where you have business continuity. And actually, I think that brings me to our closing slide before you go, because we're talking about network observability, and that's why we have Andrew here on the call, because he wrote this report, the Radar on Network Observability. And I really like that the report, it sums up the difference between observability and monitoring and who the leaders are now and also why it matters. And it's great to see enterprises taking advantage of the advancements that have been made in data pipelines and automation and in AI in the last 5 to 10 years to really get a good observability of all their environments. So you can check out this report on the internet. Oops, I got a little screenshot of it here, but you can go to kentik.com and it's actually on our homepage. So if you scroll down to the See What's New area, you'll see this and you can check out that report and read it for free. And on that note, I just want to say thanks to everybody for joining us today. And thank you, panelists, for your great insights. And have a great rest of your day, everybody who tuned in.
You as well.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much.
Bye.